You might imagine medieval history as a world of castles, knights, and loud events that changed the course of kingdoms. But if you were alive in medieval times, your life would likely have passed quietly, slowly, and almost entirely unnoticed by anyone outside your village. You would probably not have been noble, wealthy, or powerful. You would have been a peasant, and your days would have followed patterns so repetitive that they rarely found their way into written history. Yet, it was these lives, repeated thousands of times across fields and villages, that quietly held medieval society together. In the early medieval centuries, most people lived in small rural communities, tied closely to the land. You would wake before sunrise, not because of clocks, but because light itself was your signal. Your work was dictated by the seasons more than by any human authority. In spring, you prepared soil that had already been worked by generations before you. In summer, you harvested with aching hands. In autumn, you stored what little could be saved. In winter, you endured hunger, cold, and long darkness, hoping supplies would last until the next thaw. What history rarely tells you is how carefully organized this life actually was. Medieval peasants did not live in chaos or ignorance. Their survival depended on deep knowledge passed quietly from parent to child. You learned how to read the soil by touch, how to judge weather by the sky, and how to ration grain so it would not disappear too quickly. These skills were not written down. They lived in memory, habit, and repetition. You were also part of a system known as manorialism. This was not a single law, but a web of obligations tying you to a local lord. You worked strips of land assigned to your family, but you also owed labor to the lord who claimed authority over the area. Several days each week might be spent working fields that did not belong to you. In return, you received protection, access to mills, ovens, and sometimes shared pasture. It was not freedom, but it was stability of a kind. This stability was fragile. One poor harvest could mean disaster. 2 poor harvests could erase entire villages. You lived with this knowledge constantly. Medieval peasants developed quiet strategies to survive these risks. They mixed crops rather than relying on one grain. They gathered wild plants, nuts, and roots when possible. They raised small animals that could be slaughtered in emergencies. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools. Ash became fertilizer. Old cloth became padding or bandages. Daily life also included obligations to the church. You attended services not only for faith, but because the church structured time itself. Feast days, fast days, and saints' days marked the year. Bells told you when to work, when to rest, and when to pray. Religion offered explanation for suffering, but it also reinforced patience. Endurance was considered a virtue, and complaining too openly could bring social punishment. Your home would have been small, shared with animals, and built from local materials like wood, clay, and straw. Smoke filled the room from a central hearth. Privacy did not exist in the way you might expect today. Families slept close together. Illness spread easily. Death was familiar, especially among children. Yet even here, there was routine. Death did not stop the work of the fields. Burials were quick. Life continued. Marriage among peasants was less romantic and more practical. You married someone who could work, survive, and contribute to the household. Love sometimes followed, but survival came first. Women worked alongside men, tending animals, fields, gardens, and children simultaneously. Their labor was essential, though rarely acknowledged in records. What you might find surprising is how little interaction peasants had with large historical events. Wars often passed around villages rather than through them. Kings changed, borders shifted, but daily routines remained mostly the same. News traveled slowly. You might hear rumors months after events occurred, distorted and incomplete. Despite hardship, medieval peasants were not constantly miserable. Festivals offered brief relief. Community gatherings reinforced bonds. Storytelling, music, and shared labor created meaning in otherwise repetitive lives. There was pride in endurance, in surviving another winter, in seeing children grow strong enough to work beside you. Still, beneath this slow rhythm lay constant tension. Taxes increased without warning. Lords changed rules. Weather ignored all human effort. You lived knowing that no matter how careful you were, forces beyond your control could undo everything overnight. This awareness shaped a worldview that valued patience over ambition, tradition over innovation. As you drift through these quiet details of medieval peasant life, it becomes clear that history is not only shaped by dramatic moments, but by countless ordinary days stacked together. These unnoticed lives formed the foundation of medieval society, yet their stories were rarely recorded in detail, and it leaves an unsettling question behind. If so much of medieval survival depended on systems never written down, how much of that hidden knowledge disappeared forever when villages failed or communities quietly vanished? As you continue to settle into the slow rhythm of medieval peasant life, you begin to notice that survival depended not only on physical labor, but on an intricate web of social expectations that governed nearly every interaction. These expectations were rarely written down, yet everyone understood them. They shaped how help was given, how disputes were resolved, and how entire communities endured long periods of stress without falling apart. You lived in a village where everyone knew your family history, your habits, and even your weaknesses. This closeness could feel suffocating, but it also acted as a safety net. When illness struck your household, neighbors often stepped in to help with harvesting or animal care, not out of charity alone, but because they knew they might soon need the same help themselves. This quiet exchange of labor was one of the most important survival systems in medieval rural life, yet it left almost no trace in official records. Disputes were handled locally whenever possible. You did not rush to distant courts or appeal to high authorities. Instead, elders of the village or representatives of the lord mediated conflicts over land boundaries, livestock damage, or unpaid obligations. The goal was not justice in a modern sense, but stability. A feud could ruin a village more effectively than a poor harvest. Compromise was often forced, and resentment was swallowed for the sake of continued survival. The land itself was divided in ways that might seem inefficient to you today. Fields were often split into long, narrow strips scattered across different areas. This was not accidental. It ensured that no single family held only poor or only fertile land. If one area flooded or failed, losses were shared across the community. This arrangement reduced envy and limited catastrophic inequality, but it also tied families tightly to collective decisions. You were constantly aware of obligations owed to the lord. These included labor, portions of crops, and various fees for using mills, ovens, or presses. While modern descriptions often portray these demands as purely exploitative, the reality was more complex. Lords relied on peasants for income and stability, while peasants relied on lords for protection and legal authority. When this balance broke down, villages suffered quickly. Periods of famine reveal the quiet strength of these systems. During extended food shortages, peasants altered diets drastically. Bread was stretched with ground peas, bark, or grasses. Meat disappeared almost entirely. People ate what they could find, not because they did not know better, but because survival demanded flexibility. Church authorities sometimes encouraged fasting, framing hunger as spiritual discipline, which helped communities endure deprivation with a sense of purpose. Children were drawn into this system early. You would have learned tasks almost as soon as you could walk steadily. Herding animals, gathering firewood, carrying water, and watching younger siblings were part of daily life. Childhood as a protected phase barely existed, yet this early responsibility created competence. By adolescence, you were already an essential worker. Illness hovered constantly. Without reliable medical knowledge, communities relied on practical experience, herbal remedies, rest when possible, and isolation of the sick were common strategies. Some treatments helped, others harmed, but the act of caring itself reinforced bonds. You learned which neighbors had knowledge of certain plants or techniques, and that knowledge became quietly valued. Death, too, was communal. Funerals were simple, often followed quickly by a return to work. Grief was real, but extended mourning was a luxury few could afford. The dead were remembered in prayer and story, but life pressed forward relentlessly. This acceptance of death shaped a worldview that was less shocked by loss, though not necessarily less pained by it. Religion continued to structure not just belief, but daily time management. Bells marked work hours. Saints' days provided brief pauses in labor. You measured your life less in years and more in seasons and feast cycles. This repetition offered comfort. Change was slow, and novelty was often viewed with suspicion. Yet even in this conservative environment, small changes crept in. New tools appeared gradually. Farming techniques shifted almost imperceptibly. A heavier plow here, a new crop rotation there. These innovations spread slowly through observation rather than instruction. You learned by watching what worked for others, adopting changes cautiously. What becomes clear is that medieval peasant life was not static ignorance, but adaptive endurance. Every habit existed because it had once solved a problem. Every custom reduced risk in a world where failure meant hunger or death. The system was not kind, but it was functional. Still, this system depended on trust. Trust that neighbors would help. Trust that lords would not demand too much. Trust that the seasons would eventually turn. When that trust failed, when obligations increased or disasters stacked upon each other, the entire structure trembled. As you rest within these quiet patterns of shared labor and unspoken rules, a deeper uncertainty emerges. If medieval peasant life depended so heavily on cooperation and balance, what happened when that balance finally broke under pressure from forces too large for any village to manage? As you move toward the end of this quiet story, the delicate balance that sustained medieval peasant life begins to reveal its limits. For generations, routines, customs and shared endurance held villages together, but there were moments when no amount of cooperation or patience could protect them. These moments rarely appear as dramatic turning points in traditional history, yet they quietly reshaped the medieval world by erasing communities without leaving clear explanations behind. One of the greatest pressures came from forces peasants could neither predict nor influence. Weather patterns shifted unexpectedly. A sequence of cold, wet summers could rot crops before harvest. Long winters stretched stored food thin. You might endure one bad year by borrowing grain, eating seed reserves, or selling possessions. 2 bad years forced harsher choices. By the third, entire families faced starvation. Villages that had survived for centuries could fail within a decade. When survival became impossible, people moved. This movement was often small and undocumented. Families slipped away to nearby towns, or more fertile regions, seeking work as laborers. Some joined monasteries, as lay workers. Others became beggars. These migrations rarely appear in records, but they emptied villages slowly, leaving fields untended and houses collapsing back into the earth. Lords responded unevenly. Some reduced demands temporarily, understanding that dead peasants produced nothing. Others increased pressure, attempting to extract as much as possible before total collapse. This often accelerated decline. When obligations outweighed survival, peasants fled, resisted quietly, or in rare cases, openly rebelled. Even then, rebellion was less about ideology and more about desperation. Disease amplified these stresses. Epidemics moved through tightly knit communities with devastating speed. Without understanding contagion, peasants relied on prayer, isolation, and routine. When illness struck during already lean years, recovery became unlikely. Entire households vanished. Fields lay unused not because of neglect, but because no one remained to work them. The collapse of a village did not always leave visible ruins. Timber buildings decayed quickly. Roofs fell in. Paths disappeared under grass. Within a generation, only faint earthworks or field patterns hinted that people had once lived there. Medieval chroniclers focused on kings and wars, not abandoned settlements. Silence replaced memory. Yet even in failure, peasant systems influenced the future. Survivors carried knowledge with them. They brought farming techniques, communal habits, and survival strategies into towns and new regions. These quiet transfers shaped medieval economies more than any decree. Urban growth in later centuries depended heavily on former peasants adapting rural skills to new environments. By the later medieval period, pressures accumulated across Europe. Climate fluctuations, population growth, increased taxation, and expanding markets strained traditional systems. The old balance of manorial life weakened. Some peasants gained more freedom through labor shortages. Others sank deeper into poverty. Change arrived not through sudden revolution, but through erosion. What is striking is how little this transformation felt like progress at the time. For those living through it, the breakdown of familiar systems meant uncertainty, not opportunity. Stability, even harsh stability, was preferable to risk. The medieval peasant did not dream of social mobility in modern terms. Survival itself was achievement enough. As you reflect on these lives, you might notice how much of their world depended on cooperation, rather than control, on memory, rather than written law. Their resilience lay not in heroic acts, but in persistence. They endured until endurance was no longer enough. The medieval world eventually moved on. New economic structures emerged. Old villages faded into fields and forests. Yet the foundation of modern society was built quietly by people whose names were never recorded, whose struggles were ordinary, and whose successes were simply measured in another year lived. When you imagine a medieval monastery, you might picture quiet stone buildings, monks in simple robes, and long hours of prayer. What is less often discussed is how these places quietly became some of the most important centers of care for the sick, the poor, and the unwanted. Long before hospitals existed in the modern sense, monasteries filled a gap that no other institution was willing or able to address. If you were ill in medieval times, your options were limited. Physicians were rare, expensive, and often distrusted. Most medical care happened at home, relying on family knowledge, herbal remedies, and prayer. But when illness became severe, chronic, or socially isolating, home care was not always possible. This was especially true if you were poor, elderly, disabled, or alone. For people in these situations, monasteries offered something rare. They offered shelter without demanding productivity. Monastic care did not begin as a medical project. It emerged gradually from religious duty. Monks and nuns followed rules that emphasized charity, hospitality, and care for the vulnerable. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor were to be welcomed as if they were sacred guests. Over time, this principle expanded. Sick bodies, even those that frightened others, were seen as burdens the faithful were obligated to carry. You would not have entered a monastery hospital expecting cures. The goal was not recovery in the modern sense. The goal was care, cleanliness, as understood at the time, and spiritual preparation. Many patients were not expected to survive. Monastic care focused on easing suffering, providing regular food, warmth, and prayer. In a world where abandonment was common, this alone was significant. Inside these monastic infirmaries, daily life followed a slow rhythm. Beds were simple, often separated to limit noise and disturbance rather than infection. Light entered through small windows. Silence was valued, not just for discipline, but because it allowed the sick to rest. Monks and nuns learned practical caregiving through repetition. They cleaned wounds, prepared herbal infusions, changed bedding, and sat with the dying. Medical knowledge was limited, but not absent. Monasteries preserved ancient texts from Greek and Roman authors. Some monks studied these works carefully, copying them by hand. Herbal medicine played a major role. Gardens were cultivated specifically for healing plants. You might receive preparations made from sage, fennel, or honey. While effectiveness varied, these treatments reflected accumulated experience rather than superstition alone. What made monasteries unique was their willingness to care for people others avoided. Those with disfiguring illnesses, chronic conditions, or advanced age often had nowhere else to go. Families struggling to survive might bring a relative to a monastery, not out of cruelty, but desperation. The monastery became a place where burdens were absorbed quietly, without public judgment. This care extended beyond monks themselves. Lay people were admitted to monastic infirmaries when space allowed. In some regions, entire hospital wings were built next to monasteries, funded by donations from wealthy patrons seeking spiritual merit. These hospitals were not busy centers of innovation. They were places of maintenance, where lives were sustained gently for as long as possible. You might expect tension between spiritual duties and physical care, but in medieval thought, the two were inseparable. Illness was understood as both bodily and spiritual. Prayer accompanied treatment. Confession and last rites were considered as important as medicine. For patients, this offered structure during uncertainty. For caregivers, it gave meaning to exhausting work. Daily routines were strict. Care was provided at set times. Meals were simple but regular. Broths, bread, and watered wine were common. Patients were encouraged to rest rather than struggle to contribute. This removal from labor was unusual in medieval society, where usefulness often determined worth. Within monastery walls, usefulness was redefined as endurance. Not all monasteries were equally compassionate. Resources varied widely. Some were overcrowded and underfunded. Others became selective, favoring donors or pilgrims over locals. Still, even imperfect care represented an alternative to neglect. For many, entering a monastery infirmary meant safety from hunger and exposure, even if recovery never came. As time passed, monasteries became informal centers of medical learning. Younger monks observed elder caregivers. Practices were refined slowly. Notes were sometimes added to manuscripts. Knowledge spread not through lectures but through habit. This slow accumulation laid groundwork for later hospital systems, though few recognized it at the time. What is rarely emphasized is the emotional labor involved. Caring for the sick meant constant exposure to suffering and death. Monks and nuns were not immune to grief. Their rules encouraged emotional restraint, but not indifference. They learned to continue their duties, even as patients died quietly around them. As you rest with this picture of monastic care, you may begin to sense its quiet importance. These were not places of dramatic healing or discovery. They were places where people were allowed to exist when they no longer fit into productive society. Yet this raises a deeper question. As monasteries became central to caring for the forgotten, how did this responsibility shape their power, their resources, and their relationship with the wider medieval world? As monasteries continued to absorb the responsibility of caring for the sick and unwanted, their role within medieval society expanded in ways that were both practical and quietly political. What began as an act of religious duty slowly turned monasteries into essential institutions that communities depended on, even if they rarely acknowledged this dependence openly. If you lived near a monastery, you likely knew its routines well. Bells marked prayer, meals, and rest. But behind these rhythms, another schedule existed. The infirmary followed its own careful order. Caregivers rose early to check on patients, prepare simple remedies, and clean shared spaces. Cleanliness, though limited by knowledge and resources, was taken seriously. Fresh water was fetched regularly. Bedding was aired when weather allowed. These practices did not prevent disease, but they reduced discomfort and sometimes improved survival. The growing number of patients forced monasteries to make choices. Space was finite. Food supplies depended on harvests and donations. Some monasteries created informal rules about who could be admitted. Pilgrims often received priority, as they were seen as spiritually significant travelers. Locals without family support were next. Those with contagious or frightening conditions were sometimes isolated or turned away, despite religious ideals. Compassion existed, but it was constrained by reality. As care expanded, so did costs. Monasteries relied heavily on donations from nobles and wealthy townspeople. In return, donors expected prayers for their souls and sometimes preferential treatment if illness struck their families. This exchange was not always comfortable. It blurred the line between charity and obligation. Still, it allowed monastic hospitals to survive and even grow. Over time, monasteries developed reputations. Some were known for treating specific ailments, whether through effective herbal knowledge or simple consistency of care. Word traveled slowly but persistently. A monastery that provided reliable shelter during sickness became a quiet landmark within a region. People planned journeys around it. Families remembered it during crises. This growing importance gave monasteries influence. Local authorities often consulted abbots and abbesses during public health crises, such as outbreaks of disease or food shortages. Monasteries stored surplus grain when possible, and distributed it carefully during lean times. This role was not officially assigned, but it was expected. Failure to meet these expectations could damage a monastery's standing in the community. Inside the infirmary, patients experienced a strange mixture of relief and loss. Relief came from regular meals, warmth, and attention. Loss came from separation from family and familiar routines. For some, entering a monastery hospital marked a permanent transition. Recovery might be slow or incomplete. Others stayed until death. The monastery became their final community. Caregivers adapted emotionally. They learned to maintain steady routines in the face of constant decline. Emotional distance was encouraged, but complete detachment was impossible. Bonds formed quietly, especially with long-term patients. Names were remembered. Small preferences were honored when possible. These gestures mattered in a world where individual comfort was rarely prioritized. Monastic medicine remained conservative. New ideas were adopted cautiously. Practices that appeared to work were repeated. Those that failed were quietly abandoned. Without formal experimentation, progress was slow but steady. Knowledge moved through observation and copying, not innovation for its own sake. Tensions occasionally surfaced. Town physicians, where they existed, sometimes resented monastic caregivers. Monasteries treated patients without charging fees, undermining professional authority. At the same time, monasteries lacked advanced training. This uneasy coexistence reflected a broader medieval reality. Expertise was fragmented and deeply tied to social roles. For the sick, these tensions mattered little. What mattered was care. In a time when abandonment was common, monasteries offered continuity. You were fed, even when you could not work. You were spoken to, prayed for, and not immediately discarded. Yet, this growing responsibility placed strain on monastic life itself. Caregiving consumed time meant for prayer and study. Some monks questioned whether their institutions were drifting from spiritual purpose. Others argued that service to the suffering was the highest form of devotion. These debates rarely reached the public, but they shaped internal rules and daily routines. As monasteries balanced spiritual ideals with practical demands, their identity shifted. They became places not only of withdrawal from the world, but of deep involvement in its problems. This involvement brought influence, expectations, and pressure. As you sit with this gradual transformation, another uncertainty emerges. When monasteries became central to caring for the sick and forgotten, what happened when they themselves were overwhelmed by crises too large for prayer, routine, and quiet endurance alone? As the weight of care continued to grow, monasteries eventually faced moments when their quiet systems strained beyond capacity. These moments did not arrive with ceremony or announcement. They arrived through accumulation, one more patient than a bed could hold, one more winter than stored grain could support, one more outbreak than prayer and routine could contain. When widespread disease swept through medieval regions, monasteries were often among the first places people turned to, and tragically, among the first places to suffer collapse. Caregivers worked in close quarters with the sick. Isolation was imperfect. Illness spread easily among monks and nuns themselves. Entire communities fell ill at once. In some cases, there were too few healthy members left to care for anyone. You can imagine the stillness of these moments. Bells went unrung. Prayers were shortened or skipped. Infirmaries filled with bodies while caretakers lay beside them, unable to rise. Records from later centuries hint at these failures only indirectly, through sudden gaps in monastic chronicles or abrupt changes in leadership. Famine created similar pressure. Monasteries depended on surrounding lands and donations. When harvests failed widely, surplus vanished. Monasteries faced impossible choices: feed the sick and starve the healthy, or preserve the community and turn others away. Neither choice aligned comfortably with religious ideals. Decisions were made quietly, often leaving lasting guilt within the community. Political changes also reshaped monastic care. As towns grew and secular authorities strengthened, new expectations emerged. Monasteries were asked to support armies, house refugees, or contribute financially to wars. Resources once reserved for the sick were diverted. The monastery remained a place of care, but its ability to prioritize the forgotten weakened. Despite these pressures, the monastic model left a lasting legacy. Practices developed within infirmaries influenced the creation of later hospitals. The idea that care should be provided without expectation of productivity took root slowly. Record-keeping improved. Roles became specialized. Lay caregivers trained within monasteries carried skills outward. By the later medieval period, care began to shift. Municipal hospitals appeared in growing towns. These institutions borrowed heavily from monastic routines while introducing stricter rules and broader oversight. Monasteries did not disappear from medical care, but they were no longer alone. For the forgotten, this transition was uneven. Some benefited from expanded facilities. Others fell through gaps as systems reorganized. Change brought improvement, but also new forms of exclusion. Care became more structured, but less personal. What remains striking is how monasteries normalized the idea that the sick deserved space, time, and dignity. This idea did not emerge from medical success, but from endurance. Monks and nuns stayed when others left. They cleaned, fed, and prayed long after hope of recovery faded. Their work rarely appears in grand historical narratives. There were no battles won, no treaties signed, yet countless lives ended with comfort rather than abandonment. Because of these quiet institutions, the impact was subtle, but deep. As you reflect on monasteries as places of care, you might notice how modern hospitals still carry traces of these early models. Scheduled routines, designated wards, and the expectation of compassionate service all echo medieval practices, even as technology has transformed outcomes. This story settles not with triumph, but with continuity. Care did not eliminate suffering, but it reshaped how society responded to it, and it leaves you with a final, lingering question. As systems of care evolve and grow more complex, how easily could they once again become overwhelmed, leaving the most vulnerable dependent on quiet endurance rather than guaranteed support? If you imagine travel in medieval times, you might think of merchants moving between cities or messengers carrying urgent news. What you may not realize is how rare and risky travel truly was for most people. For the average medieval person, life unfolded within a very small radius. Many lived and died without ever going more than a few miles from where they were born. Roads existed, but they were not built for comfort, speed, or safety. They were simply paths worn into the land by repeated use. If you chose to travel, it was usually out of necessity rather than curiosity. You might be forced onto the road by hunger, debt, marriage, pilgrimage, or war. Each reason carried its own risks, but all shared the same physical challenges. Medieval roads were often little more than dirt tracks. If you chose to travel, it was usually out of necessity rather than dirt tracks. In dry weather, they turned to dust that coated your throat and eyes. In rain, they became deep mud that clung to feet and wheels, slowing progress to a crawl. There were few signs to guide you. Directions were learned by memory or local knowledge. You relied on landmarks such as trees, rivers, shrines, or abandoned buildings. If you missed a turn, you could wander for hours or days. Getting lost was not an inconvenience. It could mean running out of food or water, or stumbling into areas where help was unlikely. Travel was slow. On foot, you covered limited distance each day, especially if you carried supplies. Animals helped, but they needed care and rest. Carts broke easily, bridges were rare and often unsafe. Crossing rivers meant waiting for shallow points or risking strong currents. Many travelers drowned quietly, their deaths never recorded. You did not travel alone if you could avoid it. Solitary travelers were vulnerable. Groups offered protection, shared knowledge, and pooled resources. Even then, danger lingered. Robbery was common but not always violent. Thieves often relied on intimidation rather than force. Losing supplies could be as deadly as injury. The road itself was a place of exposure. You slept outdoors, or in crowded inns when available. Inns varied widely. Some offered warmth and food, others were dirty, loud, and unsafe. Disease spread easily in such places. Sharing beds with strangers was normal. Privacy did not exist. Neither did cleanliness in the modern sense. Weather shaped every journey. Heat exhausted you. Cold stiffened muscles and slowed movement. Sudden storms could trap you between rivers or in forests. There were no forecasts. You read the sky and hoped your judgment was correct. Many journeys were delayed for weeks by conditions no one could control. Food was a constant concern. You carried what you could, but it spoiled quickly. Bread hardened. Meat turned unsafe. You depended on villagers along the way, but hospitality was not guaranteed. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. In times of scarcity, doors stayed closed. Roadside shrines and monasteries offered some relief. Pilgrims relied on them heavily. These places provided rest, prayer, and sometimes food. They also marked routes, acting as quiet guides across unfamiliar land. Without them, long-distance travel would have been nearly impossible. There was also the danger of misunderstanding. Accents changed quickly over short distances. Customs differed. A gesture meant to show respect in one region could cause offense in another. As a traveler, you learned to speak little and observe carefully. Despite these risks, roads connected the medieval world. Goods, ideas, and people moved slowly along them. News traveled by word of mouth, changing with each telling. By the time you heard of an event, it might already be months old and altered beyond recognition. What history rarely records is the emotional weight of travel. Fear accompanied each step. You worried about injury, theft, illness, and rejection. You worried about not returning home. Many who left never did, absorbed into new places or lost along the way. As you imagine yourself walking these uneven paths, listening for sounds ahead, watching the sky for signs of change, you begin to understand how movement itself shaped medieval thinking. Stability was valued because travel was dangerous. Familiarity meant safety. Yet people continued to walk these roads despite the risks. Something compelled them forward. Need, faith, and hope pushed them beyond known boundaries. And this leads to a quiet question that lingers at the edge of the road. When travel itself was a test of survival, how did those who spent their lives moving from place to place manage to endure it at all? As you remain on these medieval roads a little longer, you begin to notice that danger did not always come from sudden violence or dramatic events. Much of it arrived slowly, through exhaustion, uncertainty, and the gradual wearing down of the body and mind. Travel was not only a physical challenge, it was a psychological one, shaped by constant vigilance and the knowledge that help might be days away. Those who traveled often learned to read people as carefully as they read the land. Every encounter carried risk. A friendly greeting could lead to shelter or to betrayal. You watched how others spoke, how they stood, how quickly they answered questions. Trust was built cautiously and abandoned just as quickly. This constant alertness drained energy in ways no chronicler ever recorded. Merchants experienced these pressures regularly. While some traveled in caravans, many moved alone or with minimal protection. Goods were packed carefully to reduce loss, but theft was common and often subtle. A missing pouch, a loosened strap, a dishonest wait at a roadside market could undo weeks of effort. Disputes rarely ended in justice. You learned to absorb small losses rather than risk greater ones. Pilgrims faced different challenges. Their travel was framed as spiritual duty, but the physical reality was harsh. Pilgrimage routes were crowded at certain times, increasing risk of disease and conflict. Yet, pilgrims continued, driven by belief, fear, or hope of healing. Many were already ill when they began their journeys, hoping that movement itself might bring relief or forgiveness. You might also encounter people who lived almost entirely on the road. Messengers, drovers, entertainers, and laborers moved constantly between towns and estates. These individuals developed survival strategies unknown to settled villagers. They memorized safe resting places, reliable hosts, and dangerous stretches to avoid. Their knowledge was practical and hard-won, passed through conversation rather than instruction. Clothing mattered more than you might expect. Travelers wore garments chosen for durability, rather than comfort. Shoes wore out quickly on uneven paths. Blisters and infections followed. Once injured, walking became agonizing. Many journeys ended not because of dramatic danger, but because the body simply could not continue. Animals provided assistance, but introduced new risks. Horses required care, food, and rest. An injured animal could strand you far from help. Pack animals attracted thieves. Carts broke under strain. Repairs were slow and improvised. Travel demanded constant problem-solving. Forests were particularly feared. They offered shelter from weather, but also concealment for bandits and wild animals. Sounds carried strangely among trees. A snapped branch could signal danger, or nothing at all. Many travelers avoided forests, even if it lengthened their journey, preferring open land where threats were visible. Legal authority was uneven along roads. Jurisdictions changed frequently. What was permitted in one region could be punished in another. Travelers were vulnerable to fines, tolls, or detention simply for being unfamiliar. Carrying letters of passage or seals helped, but not everyone had access to them. Disease traveled alongside people. Roads were channels not just for goods and ideas but for illness. Inns became hubs of transmission. A night of shared space could change the course of your life. You might leave healthy and arrive sick, with no understanding of why. Despite these dangers, travel continued because it had to. Markets depended on movement. Religious life depended on pilgrimage. Political authority depended on messengers. Roads were fragile lifelines holding medieval society together. What becomes clear is that travel shaped medieval values deeply. Caution was praised. Hospitality was conditional. Stability was idealized. Movement was respected but feared. To leave home was to accept uncertainty fully. As you walk these roads in thought, you may begin to sense the quiet bravery involved. Not the bravery of battle but of endurance. Step after step, risk after risk, without guarantee of return. And this leaves a final uncertainty lingering ahead on the path. When travel demanded such constant vigilance and sacrifice, how did medieval societies manage long-distance trade, communication, and control at all, without collapsing under the weight of distance itself? As you continue along these imagined medieval roads toward their quieter end, you begin to see how societies adapted to distance rather than defeating it. Medieval people did not solve the dangers of travel. They learned to work around them. The result was a world that moved slowly, carefully, and with deep respect for the limits of human endurance. Long-distance trade survived because it was selective. Not everything was worth moving. Heavy or low-value goods stayed close to where they were produced. What traveled were items that justified risk and effort. Salt, spices, cloth, metals, and written messages moved along roads because their value outweighed the dangers. Entire trade networks developed around predictable routes where risk was known rather than avoided. You might expect centralized control to manage this movement, but much of it relied on trust built over generations. Merchants formed loose associations, families specialized in certain routes, knowledge of safe paths, reliable inns, and honest partners was guarded carefully. This informal infrastructure mattered more than any official road maintenance. Communication adapted similarly. Messengers did not rush blindly. They planned routes around seasons, weather, and political stability. Messages were brief, because writing materials were expensive, and time was uncertain. Important news traveled redundantly, carried by multiple people, increasing the chance that at least one would arrive. Local authorities also adjusted expectations. Orders were issued with long delays in mind. Responses were slow. Power was decentralized because it had to be. A lord could not enforce control everywhere at once. Communities retained autonomy simply because reaching them took too long. For travelers themselves, adaptation meant ritual. You prayed before leaving. You prepared wills even for short journeys. Departure was treated seriously because absence might be permanent. Return was celebrated quietly. Survival was success. Over time, infrastructure improved modestly. Bridges were built at key crossings. Roadside markers appeared near important routes. Monasteries expanded hospitality. None of this eliminated danger, but it reduced uncertainty. These improvements came not from grand plans but from repeated need. What is striking is how travel shaped mental boundaries. Distance created difference. Regions developed distinct identities because movement was limited. Dialects, customs, and laws diversified. The medieval world was interconnected, but loosely, like a fabric with wide spaces between threads. As conditions changed in later centuries, travel gradually became safer and more common. But during most of the medieval period, the road remained a place of vulnerability. This vulnerability influenced how people thought about home, community, and belonging. When you step back from these roads, you might notice how different this world feels from your own. Today, distance often seems trivial. In medieval times, it was a barrier that shaped everything from trade to belief. This story settles not with arrival, but with pause. Roads existed not to encourage movement, but to permit it cautiously. They connected the medieval world while reminding everyone of its limits. And as you rest at the edge of this path, a final reflection emerges. If medieval societies survived by respecting distance and moving slowly, what has been gained and what might have been quietly lost as speed and certainty replaced patience and endurance? When you think about power in medieval towns, your mind may drift toward male figures such as lords, bishops, guildmasters, or city officials whose names appear in records. What often goes unnoticed is how much daily authority rested in the hands of women who never held formal titles, yet quietly managed the systems that kept towns functioning. Their influence was not declared, it was practiced. If you lived in a medieval town, you would have encountered women everywhere, though rarely acknowledged by chroniclers. They ran households that doubled as workshops. They managed finances while husbands traveled or worked long hours. They controlled access to food, labor, and information in ways that shaped urban life more deeply than official decrees. Many medieval towns depended on small-scale trade. Bakers, brewers, cloth workers, and market sellers formed the backbone of urban economies. Women were central to these trades. Brewing, for example, was commonly done by women for both household use and sale. Bread baking followed similar patterns. These were not side activities. They were essential services. A failure in bread supply could cause unrest faster than any political dispute. You might assume guilds excluded women entirely, but reality was uneven. While formal membership was often restricted, women worked within guild structures as widows, daughters, or informal partners. A widow could inherit her husband's business and continue operating it legally. Some became respected figures within their trades, even if records listed them simply as someone's wife or widow. Markets were spaces where women exercised visible authority. Female vendors set prices, negotiated, and enforced standards through reputation. A dishonest seller did not need punishment from officials. Social pressure was often enough. Trust mattered in tight communities, and women were skilled at maintaining it. Beyond trade, women controlled information. Town life depended on conversation. News traveled through wells, ovens, and shared spaces. Women exchanged updates about shortages, disputes, and opportunities. This informal network shaped behavior long before announcements were made publicly. You learned what was coming by listening carefully. Women also managed credit. Small loans, delayed payments, and shared resources kept households afloat. These arrangements were rarely written down, yet they prevented collapse during hard times. A woman who managed these exchanges poorly could destabilize multiple families. One who managed them well became quietly indispensable. Religious life provided another avenue of influence. Women organized charitable acts, cared for the sick, and maintained devotional spaces. Some joined religious communities without taking full vows, living within towns while dedicating their lives to service. These women moved freely between households and institutions. connecting people who might otherwise remain isolated. Domestic space itself was political. Decisions made inside homes affected labor availability, trade output, and social stability. Women decided when children worked, when food was shared, and when help was requested. These choices shaped the resilience of entire neighborhoods. Conflict resolution often passed through women as well. Arguments between families were softened through negotiation, apology, or shared obligation. Women understood the cost of open conflict. They worked to contain it quietly, preserving relationships that towns depended on for survival. Legal records occasionally reveal this influence indirectly. You see women listed as witnesses, debt holders, or petitioners. These fragments hint at broader authority exercised daily without documentation. Absence from records does not mean absence from power. What makes this history difficult to trace is its ordinariness. Nothing dramatic announces it. No single moment defines it. Yet towns functioned because women balanced competing needs constantly. They adapted to shortages, illness, and absence with practical decisions made under pressure. As you begin to notice these patterns, medieval towns appear less rigid and more flexible than traditional narratives suggest. Authority flowed through daily action rather than titles alone. This leaves a question lingering beneath the surface. If so much urban stability depended on women whose work went unrecorded, what happened to that balance when crisis or change disrupted their quiet authority? As you continue to observe the rhythms of medieval town life, it becomes clearer that the influence of women extended far beyond household management and market stalls. Their authority was subtle but pervasive, shaping economic stability, social cohesion, and even political negotiation in ways that official records rarely acknowledge. Consider trade networks first. Town economies depended on reliable production and exchange of goods. Women ensured continuity even when men were absent, traveling or engaged in guild affairs. In many cases, they supervised apprentices, managed supplies, and maintained accounts. A single miscalculation, overbaking, underweaving, mismanaging stock, could ripple across multiple households, threatening both income and reputation. Women who mastered these tasks became central nodes in urban networks, trusted and consulted by neighbors and business partners alike. You might assume that disputes automatically fell to male authorities. In reality, women often acted as first mediators. They negotiated directly with neighbors over debts, rental spaces, or supply shortages. Their intervention was practical rather than ceremonial. A calm word, a timely gesture, or a shared meal could prevent conflict from escalating to formal courts. Sometimes, legal disputes arose only after women's efforts failed, revealing the invisible labor that usually maintained order. Religious institutions amplified this influence. Many women were deeply involved in parish life, organizing donations, maintaining altars, and coordinating community support for the poor or sick. Their position allowed them to shape charitable practices, decide which families received aid, and guide spiritual observances that reinforced social cohesion. Even informal pious women, those who did not take vows, used their proximity to the church to influence local behavior quietly. The resilience of towns often rested on women's adaptability. Shortages, illness, and economic fluctuations demanded flexible solutions. Women pooled resources, shared labor across households, and adapted production to meet demand. For instance, during food scarcity, they rationed carefully, substituted ingredients, or coordinated small-scale trade to prevent collapse. When epidemics struck, women often assumed responsibility for care and isolation, acting as first responders long before physicians or official authorities intervened. Widowhood created an unusual form of authority. A widow inheriting her late husband's business gained both responsibility and autonomy. Without male oversight, she could make decisions about labor, pricing, and trade routes independently. Many became respected figures, not because laws explicitly permitted it, but because their competence ensured community survival. Their influence, however, remained precarious. Remarriage or the death of apprentices could quickly redistribute power back into male hands. Information control further extended women's reach. News, gossip, and market intelligence often circulated through kitchens, laundries, and wells. Women tracked shortages, anticipated arrival of goods, and knew which families were in need. This informal intelligence guided trade, social support, and even town decisions. While no official ledger recorded this influence, it structured daily life more reliably than any written decree. Challenges were constant. Social norms limited public recognition of female authority. Women had to navigate expectations carefully, balancing competence with discretion. Overstepping boundaries could invite criticism or legal retaliation. Yet, within these constraints, skilled women found ways to exercise power that affected towns more consistently than many of the formerly titled men around them. Physical spaces reinforced their authority. Workshops connected to homes allowed women to monitor both production and family labor simultaneously. Market stalls doubled as information hubs. Kitchens served as places where resources were allocated and disputes mediated. These spaces were extensions of influence, subtle but essential for maintaining balance in urban life. Despite the significance of their roles, chroniclers seldom named these women. Records preserved names only when necessary for legal reasons, usually tied to property or inheritance. As a result, much of this influence exists only as traces, patterns inferred from economic stability, legal documents, and occasional references in parish records. What becomes evident is that medieval towns relied on a quiet, largely invisible system of female authority. These women maintained continuity, managed crises, and negotiated the tension between tradition and necessity. Their power was practical, relational, and essential, even if never formally acknowledged. Yet, this influence carried fragility. Crises, epidemics, wars, economic upheaval could disrupt the networks women maintained. A sudden death, migration, or political change threatened not only their authority, but the stability of entire neighborhoods. This raises an unsettling question. In a world where official power was male-dominated, how resilient were towns when the silent labor of women was removed or undermined? As you reach the final understanding of women's influence in medieval towns, it becomes clear that their authority was both enduring and delicate. These were not public leaders wielding overt power. They were managers, negotiators, and caregivers who operated in the spaces between formal structures, shaping urban life quietly, day by day, without recognition or reward. Crises tested this hidden authority repeatedly. Epidemics, such as the recurring waves of plague, disrupted daily routines, markets closed, trade slowed, families were sick or dying. In these moments, women often assumed full responsibility for survival, distributing scarce food, tending the sick, and maintaining the households of absent or incapacitated men. Their decisions determined whether a family survived, whether debts were met, and whether local networks of support held together. Even when the immediate threat passed, long-term economic and social consequences lingered. Widows who survived became central figures, inheriting businesses and responsibilities previously held by men. Some successfully managed enterprises for decades, maintaining production and community trust. Others struggled against systemic limitations. Remarriage often stripped women of control, and legal norms frequently curtailed their autonomy. These fluctuations shaped the stability of entire neighborhoods and markets. The social networks that women maintained were equally significant. Kitchens, workshops, wells, and parish spaces functioned as hubs for information, coordination, and negotiation. When crises threatened, these informal channels allowed rapid dissemination of knowledge about shortages, illness, and opportunity. Towns relied on these networks more than formal authorities, because they moved faster, adapted to local conditions, and drew on relationships built over years. Yet, the fragility of these systems remained ever-present. Political shifts, expansion of guild authority, and changing legal codes often eroded the space for women's influence. A town could function smoothly for decades, only to see its stability falter when external pressures disrupted the delicate balance of informal leadership. When women were removed, through death, relocation, or restriction, the ripple effects touched households, markets, and social cohesion alike. Despite this fragility, the legacy of these women persisted. Their practices shaped how towns survived ordinary crises, how trade adapted to local needs, and how communities maintained cohesion under stress. Even when historical records erased their names, the systems they maintained influenced urban life for generations, laying foundations for later social and economic structures. What strikes you as remarkable is how enduring these invisible forms of authority were. Unlike formal offices, which changed hands publicly and visibly, women's power existed in actions, networks, and reputation. It was measured by effectiveness rather than title, and its consequences were practical and tangible. Food distributed, disputes settled, households maintained, markets kept running. As you reflect on this quiet influence, it becomes evident that medieval towns were held together not only by law and official hierarchy, but by relationships and labor that operated largely out of sight. Women's work, Trading, negotiating, caring, and coordinating was essential to this stability, yet almost entirely unrecorded. History often overlooks them, but without their interventions, towns would have faltered during crises that seemed insignificant on the scale of kingdoms, yet were devastating at the local level. This story leaves you with a thought that lingers. If the invisible labor of women was so critical to medieval urban survival, how many structures in modern society depend on hidden work, quietly sustaining communities without recognition, until sudden disruption exposes their fragility? When you think of medieval society, castles and knights might come to mind first. What you rarely consider is the quiet burden carried by ordinary people: debt. While chroniclers celebrated battles and royal decrees, most medieval individuals spent their lives navigating financial obligations that could consume them slowly and relentlessly. Poverty was pervasive, and the systems that bound people economically were often invisible, yet inescapable. If you lived in a medieval village or town, your life was immediately shaped by what you could produce and what you owed. Most families survived through a combination of labor, craft, and small-scale trade, yet survival rarely guaranteed autonomy. Every seed sown, every loaf baked, and every yard of cloth produced was subject to obligations: rent, taxes, tithes, and loans. These obligations accumulated quietly, pressing constantly against your daily life. Loans were common, but their terms were rarely forgiving. You might borrow grain to tide your family over a lean winter, or money to pay a tax or repair a roof. Interest rates varied, sometimes informally agreed, sometimes formally enforced by lenders who understood that default would yield profit, either through land seizure or extra labor obligations. Failure to repay did not merely harm your wealth, it endangered your survival and occasionally your freedom. Debt carried social consequences. You were obligated to creditors not just financially, but socially. Every unpaid obligation was visible within your community. Gossip could amplify shame. A debtor's reputation affected marriage prospects, business partnerships, and social trust. In towns, you might be barred from market stalls or excluded from guild participation until debts were cleared. The burden was both economic and psychological, compounding slowly over time. The church played a dual role. Tithes were a form of debt enforced spiritually. Failure to pay could result in penance, public shame, or exclusion from sacraments. Monasteries and religious institutions sometimes acted as lenders themselves, offering small loans with moral framing. You were obligated not just to repay money, but to honor divine order. In this way, financial and spiritual obligations intertwined, leaving little space for genuine relief. Daily life under these pressures was highly regimented. Every action had an economic consequence. Food was rationed carefully. Labor was allocated to maximize productivity. Children entered work early, often replacing or supplementing adult labor in crafts, fields, or markets. Leisure was a luxury few could afford. Even festivals were moderated by economic reality. Celebrations could not risk debt or scarcity. Poverty, in turn, shaped social behavior. You learned to borrow strategically, to lend cautiously, and to manage appearances carefully. A neighbor who seemed prosperous might secretly owe more than you. Survival depended on reading subtle signals: who had reserves, who could offer temporary assistance, who might exploit desperation. Networks of mutual aid existed, but they were fragile, dependent on trust, reputation, and circumstance. Crisis magnified these pressures. Crop failure, livestock disease, or local taxation could tip a family into extreme vulnerability. Small debts could snowball. A single missed payment might force land sale, labor servitude, or eviction. The legal system often reinforced creditor power. Courts could demand repayment without regard for survival needs. Peasants and townspeople had little recourse beyond negotiation, flight, or quiet resistance. Yet debt also created systems of resilience. Borrowing allowed people to survive lean seasons. Loans from neighbors or local lenders maintained production when immediate resources failed. Craftspeople could purchase raw materials in advance, producing goods that would be sold later to cover costs and interest. The very networks that imposed obligation also created continuity and predictability in a precarious economy. What is often overlooked is the psychological endurance required. Life under constant financial pressure demanded careful attention, patience, and planning. Mistakes had real consequences. The smallest miscalculation, a bad harvest, a delayed payment, an illness, could have cascading effects. Living with debt was not just an economic condition, It was a persistent mental state, influencing choices from dawn until dusk, shaping dreams, fears, and expectations. As you consider this quiet struggle, it becomes clear that medieval life was not simply a matter of work and survival. It was a negotiation between scarcity and obligation, between immediate needs and long-term consequences. You learn to manage resources and relationships with a precision that might seem extraordinary today, yet it was ordinary for those who lived under these conditions. And so, as this first section closes, you are left with an unsettling question. If survival depended so heavily on the careful management of debt and resources, what happened when unforeseen crises, famine, disease, or political upheaval struck communities whose members were already stretched to their limits? As you continue to explore the quiet burdens of medieval debt and poverty, it becomes evident that these pressures extended beyond individual households into entire communities. One family's struggle could ripple outward, affecting neighbors, trade partners, and even local authorities. Survival was rarely an isolated effort. It depended on relationships, negotiation, and sometimes sheer endurance. When crises struck, such as poor harvests, livestock disease, or unexpected taxation, families were forced to make difficult choices. Do you sell essential tools to pay a debt, borrow from a neighbor, and risk straining trust, or reduce consumption, potentially endangering health? Each option carried consequences, both practical and social. The constant weighing of costs and benefits became a form of quiet labor, as taxing on the mind as it was on the body. Credit networks played a central role in buffering these challenges. Small-scale lending, whether from neighbors, local merchants, or religious institutions, provided temporary relief. These loans were often informal, enforced through reputation and mutual obligation, rather than strict legal contracts. You might trust a neighbor to lend grain, confident they would receive repayment or a favor in return. Yet, this trust could be fragile. A single failure, your own or another's, could disrupt multiple households. Town life introduced additional complexity. Guilds, while formerly male-dominated, relied heavily on women and extended families to maintain production. Workshops often operated on credit, purchasing raw materials in anticipation of sales. When debts could not be met due to crop failures or market fluctuations, the impact extended beyond the household, threatening apprentices, customers, and suppliers. In these ways, economic vulnerability was communal, not just individual. Social hierarchies magnified the effects of poverty. Nobles and wealthy merchants had access to loans, trade networks, and legal protections that insulated them from minor crises. Peasants and urban laborers, by contrast, faced compounding vulnerability. The legal system often sided with creditors, enforcing repayment through fines, labor obligations, or seizure of property. Failure to comply could escalate quickly, leaving families exposed and communities destabilized. Religion offered both comfort and obligation. Tithes and church fees were regular, unavoidable debts. Failing to meet them could result in public penance or exclusion from religious ceremonies. Yet, religious institutions also acted as informal lenders, providing food or small loans in exchange for spiritual obligation. This duality created a delicate balance. Faith intertwined with survival in ways that shaped behavior, morality, and social cohesion. Children entered this system early. Labor and responsibility were expected from a young age, both to contribute to the household economy and to learn the skills needed for survival. Education was often secondary to practical necessity. Every day, children observed and participated in the management of resources, repayment of debts, and negotiation of obligations. They absorbed lessons in endurance, negotiation, and prudence that would guide their adult lives. Despite the relentlessness of debt, communities developed coping mechanisms. Mutual aid, shared labor, and careful planning mitigated risk. Households rotated responsibilities, assisted neighbors in harvests, and pooled resources during shortages. These networks were informal, relying on trust and reputation rather than formal contracts, yet they were vital for collective survival. Psychological resilience was as important as material endurance. Living under constant economic pressure required a disciplined mind and careful foresight. Families developed strategies to anticipate shortages, prepare for unexpected expenses, and maintain social standing. Mistakes were costly, and recovery could take months or years. Life under debt was a continuous negotiation between immediate needs and long-term stability. Yet this system was fragile. A single disaster, crop failure, epidemic, or war could overwhelm even the most careful household. Entire communities could be destabilized when multiple families simultaneously defaulted on obligations. The balance that allowed towns and villages to function quietly for decades could unravel quickly, revealing the underlying vulnerability of everyday life. As you consider the silent endurance of people living under these pressures, a deeper question emerges. If debt and poverty shaped nearly every choice, relationship, and routine, what long-term social consequences arose when generations lived under these constant strains? And how did medieval communities adapt when the safety nets of trust and informal networks failed? As you reach the final section of this story, the quiet burden of debt in medieval life begins to reveal its broader impact on both individuals and society. The systems that bound families economically did more than control daily survival. They shaped social norms, hierarchies, and expectations for generations. Poverty was not simply a condition of scarcity, it became a defining feature of medieval existence, influencing how people thought, acted, and interacted. When households struggled under debt, their responses were varied. Some adapted with remarkable resourcefulness. Families reorganized labor, diversified income sources, and cultivated networks of support. Borrowing became an art, a careful balancing act of timing, trust, and repayment capacity. Small loans, gifts, or favors circulated quietly, stabilizing communities when formal systems failed. These informal networks were often invisible to chroniclers, yet they underpinned the functioning of towns and villages alike. Others were less fortunate. Failure to repay debts could trigger cascading consequences. Land could be seized, tools and livestock sold, or labor obligations extended indefinitely. Families could become trapped in cycles of dependency, moving from one creditor to another. In extreme cases, debt forced migration, exile, or labor in distant towns under conditions barely better than servitude. Poverty, compounded by financial obligations, limited choices and reinforced social hierarchies. Debt also influenced social behavior. Reputation mattered immensely. A household known for reliability could negotiate better terms, access shared resources, or maintain positions in guilds and markets. A misstep, missed repayment, or perceived dishonesty could isolate a family, reducing opportunities for trade, assistance, or marriage alliances. In this way, economic obligations intertwined tightly with social cohesion, enforcing norms while creating stress. Communities adapted collectively as well. Neighbors collaborated to prevent collapse. Shared labor and mutual aid were common strategies. When harvests failed, families pooled resources to ensure survival. Women often played critical roles in these networks, managing both material support and social negotiation. Children were educated early in resource management, debt tracking, and interpersonal negotiation, ensuring that knowledge and caution were passed down through generations. Religious institutions remained a double-edged presence. Tithes and ecclesiastical obligations reinforced the weight of debt. Yet monasteries and parish networks often provided relief, food, loans, or temporary shelter to those in danger of complete destitution. This interplay between obligation and support highlights the complex moral and social architecture of medieval life, where survival required both careful calculation and reliance on communal structures. Over time, persistent debt shaped long-term societal trends. It influenced migration patterns, dictated access to trades, and contributed to slow shifts in urban demographics. Generations learned to navigate scarcity with skill and endurance, yet chronic indebtedness also constrained innovation and social mobility. People became adept at preserving stability, often prioritizing survival over risk or ambition. Perhaps most striking is the psychological dimension. Living under constant financial pressure created habits of vigilance, foresight, and negotiation. Decisions that might seem trivial, how much grain to store, whether to lend a neighbor a small sum, or whether to send a child to work, carried profound consequences. Endurance became both a necessity and a defining trait, shaping character and social perception alike. As you step back from this picture, it becomes clear that medieval life was structured less by dramatic events than by slow accumulation of debts, of obligations, of small decisions that compounded into enduring outcomes. The quiet weight of poverty defined daily life, influencing what people ate, how they worked, whom they trusted, and where they lived. And so, the story closes not with resolution, but with reflection. The systems that sustained medieval communities, trust and networks, careful planning, shared labor, were fragile yet resilient. They balanced survival against scarcity, hope against obligation, and they leave a question lingering in your mind. In a world where ordinary life was dominated by unseen burdens, how much of history has been shaped not by kings and battles, but by the quiet endurance of those who struggled simply to live. When you imagine the medieval world, your mind often turns to knights, lords, and grand cathedrals. What is rarely considered are the countless craftsmen whose labor made society function, yet whose names have largely been lost to history. These individuals worked long hours in relative obscurity, producing goods, maintaining infrastructure, and shaping the physical environment of towns and villages. Their work was both ordinary and essential, forming the backbone of daily life in ways that few chronicles recorded. If you lived as a medieval craftsman, your day began early, often before sunrise. The nature of your craft dictated your hours. A blacksmith tended the forge, while the bellows cooled and heated repeatedly. A carpenter measured and cut timber with painstaking accuracy. A weaver prepared looms and threads for hours of repetitive motion. Precision mattered not just for aesthetics, but because mistakes could have serious consequences. An improperly forged horseshoe could cripple a rider, a miscut beam could compromise a building, a poorly woven cloth could unravel during use. Craftsmen were also integral to the local economy. Their skills enabled trade, both locally and across regions. A smith's ironwork might supply an entire village or be sold at distant markets. A cobbler's shoes might travel across towns and villages. A potter's wares could serve multiple households. In this way, their labor extended far beyond the workshop, connecting communities through goods that were durable, functional, and essential for survival. Apprenticeship structured this work. Young boys and sometimes girls were bound to masters for years, learning not just the technical aspects of the trade, but also discipline, patience, and social etiquette. Apprentices lived within workshops, often sleeping in lofts or attics, sharing cramped quarters with tools, materials, and senior workers. Life was regimented: early hours, long days, and strict rules designed to produce skilled laborers, capable of maintaining the quality and reputation of the workshop. Guilds emerged as central institutions regulating these crafts. Membership offered protection, training, and social support. Yet guilds were also restrictive. They controlled access to markets, regulated production standards, and dictated pricing. Masters had authority over apprentices and journeymen, and strict rules enforced hierarchy within workshops. Guilds preserved skills, but they also limited upward mobility for those without connections or the resources to join. Despite these structures, much of a craftsman's influence was invisible. Their work maintained the physical and economic fabric of towns. Roads, bridges, buildings, tools, clothing, and household items all relied on skilled labor. Without them, trade would falter, construction projects would stall, and daily life would become precarious. Society depended on the steady, precise work of people who often remained anonymous. Physical risk was ever present. Blacksmiths faced intense heat, burns, and heavy materials. Carpenters worked with sharp tools and elevated timber. Potters dealt with heavy clay and hot kilns. Illness, fatigue, and injury could interrupt livelihoods, leaving families without income. The absence of modern medical care made even minor injuries potentially catastrophic. Craftsmen were also deeply tied to the social fabric. Their workshops were centers of information exchange. News traveled through towns by word of mouth, and the presence of multiple apprentices and journeymen made workshops hubs of communal awareness. Gossip, trade news, and even local political updates passed through these spaces, giving craftsmen indirect influence beyond their material production. Economic pressure shaped every decision. Raw materials had to be procured, often through negotiation with local suppliers or trade networks. Surpluses could be sold for profit, but scarcity forced careful rationing. The success of a workshop depended on foresight, reputation, and the ability to maintain quality under constant demand. Craftsmen's labor was repetitive, exacting, and rarely celebrated. Yet without it, medieval society could not function. Roads would deteriorate, buildings would collapse, and essential goods would vanish. Their daily toil, unrecorded, unsung, and physically demanding, sustained entire communities. As you imagine walking among these workshops, inhaling the heat, dust, and smoke of production, you begin to sense the quiet endurance required to maintain such labor day after day. Lives were measured in hours of work, precision of craft, and the accumulation of skill that would outlast individual careers. And so, as this first section closes, a question lingers: if the survival of towns and trade networks depended so heavily on these hidden craftsmen, how did society respond when illness, accident, or scarcity interrupted their labor, threatening the fragile balance of medieval life? As you continue observing the lives of medieval craftsmen, the complexities of their work, and the challenges that accompanied it become clearer. Survival in these trades required not just technical skill but constant adaptation to unpredictable circumstances, fluctuations in material availability, shifting market demand, and the ever-present threat of injury or illness. Material scarcity shaped every workshop. A blacksmith might struggle to acquire iron during a poor season, forcing improvisation or substitution. Carpenters relied on timber that needed to be carefully measured, cut, and seasoned. Any flaw could compromise a structure. Potters depended on clay quality and access to fuel for kilns. Journeymen and apprentices often spent hours preparing materials before a single piece of production could begin, learning patience through repetition and the inevitability of delays. Economic pressures were relentless. Craftsmanship was valued, but survival often demanded compromise. A master might accept lower quality materials to fulfill an order quickly, or reduce wages for apprentices to sustain the workshop during lean periods. The reputation of a craftsman could rise or fall on seemingly minor errors. A crooked beam, a misshapen pot, a poorly forged tool. Reputation was currency. It determined future commissions, access to trade networks, and the ability to attract apprentices. A lapse could have cascading consequences, undermining both livelihood and social standing. Journeymen traveled to gain experience, carrying their labor and skill from town to town. This mobility allowed knowledge transfer, but also introduced new hazards. Roads were dangerous, travel was slow, and lodging was often minimal. Journeymen relied on personal networks, guild connections, or charitable institutions for support, navigating a precarious balance between opportunity and exposure to risk. Apprenticeship demanded endurance beyond skill alone. Young workers were subject to strict schedules, hierarchy, and supervision. Mistakes were corrected harshly, sometimes physically, and learning occurred under pressure. Long-term success depended on patience, adaptability, and attention to detail. The daily repetition of labor, often in close quarters with others, shaped discipline, social awareness, and resilience. Guild regulations added another layer of constraint. Standards for product quality, production methods, and pricing were enforced rigorously. Masters held authority over apprentices and journeymen, while disputes between craftsmen could escalate into guild hearings. Membership was a protective measure, but also a method of control, creating boundaries around economic activity and social mobility. Those outside guilds or lacking connections faced difficulty accessing markets or acquiring clients, forcing them to operate on the margins of the economy. Workshops were more than production sites. They were centers of information and influence. Knowledge about supply sources, customer habits, and local conditions was critical. Workshops became hubs of communication, gossip, trade news, and political updates circulated through the laboring population. A craftsman's social reach, though informal, could affect decision-making in markets, guilds, and even local governance. The physical demands of work remained relentless. Blacksmiths endured extreme heat and heavy lifting. Carpenters worked with sharp tools and at heights. Weavers and potters faced long hours of repetitive strain. Illness or injury not only threatened livelihood, but could ripple through dependent households. The loss of a single skilled worker could slow production and compromise economic stability. Despite these hardships, craftsmen exhibited remarkable ingenuity. Adaptation was constant, improvising tools, experimenting with materials, adjusting production schedules, and negotiating with suppliers and clients. Skill alone was insufficient. Success required foresight, resilience, and strategic thinking. Daily labor combined technical precision with social and economic intelligence. Yet the fragility of their existence was ever present. Wars, epidemics, or poor harvests could disrupt trade, reduce orders, and endanger entire workshops. Even communities that relied heavily on craft production were vulnerable to sudden shocks. The endurance of craftsmen was thus both a personal and communal necessity, sustaining not just livelihoods, but the functioning of medieval society itself. As you reflect on these details, it becomes apparent that medieval craftsmen were more than anonymous laborers. They were essential architects of society's stability, combining skill, vigilance, and adaptability to maintain the rhythm of daily life. And as you pause to consider their labor, a quiet question emerges. In a world so dependent on unseen skill, how often did the collapse or disruption of a single workshop ripple outward to affect towns, trade networks, and the lives of ordinary people? As you reach the final section of this story, the enduring impact of medieval craftsmen becomes strikingly clear. Their work, often unrecorded and largely anonymous, sustained the physical and economic structure of towns, villages, and even regions. Without their labor, trade networks would falter, construction projects stall, and everyday life, as mundane as shoes, tools, and household goods, would grind to a halt. Crises tested the resilience of these networks repeatedly. Epidemics, famine, and warfare disrupted production and threatened the continuity of skills. Journeymen traveling between towns might perish on dangerous roads, apprentices could be lost to illness, and master craftsmen might die unexpectedly, leaving workshops in jeopardy. Communities were acutely aware of this fragility. The survival of a single household of skilled laborers could influence the livelihood of many families and the availability of essential goods. Despite these risks, craftsmen and their apprentices adapted. Knowledge was preserved through hands-on training, repetition, and careful documentation when possible. Skills were shared across generations and among guild members, creating redundancy that helped prevent complete collapse of production. Yet, even with these measures, vulnerability persisted. Disruptions could create shortages, delayed construction, or increased prices, revealing how tightly woven social and economic stability depended on unseen labor. Guilds amplified both security and limitation. Membership ensured recognition, market access, and some legal protection. But guilds also enforced rigid structures, regulating production standards, limiting competition, and dictating apprenticeship conditions. Masters wielded significant authority over workers, controlling wages, working hours, and the transmission of skill. Apprentices had few rights and depended on their master's competence and fairness for survival and advancement. Social mobility within this system was narrow, though possible through talent, marriage, or inheritance. The physical demands of work left a lasting imprint. Long hours, repetitive motion, exposure to heat, cold, or hazardous materials, and inadequate medical knowledge meant that craftsmen's bodies were constantly at risk. Injury or illness could permanently end careers, forcing reliance on family or community for support. Yet despite this, labor continued, maintained by necessity, pride, and the understanding that life itself depended on these contributions. The social dimension of craftsmanship was also profound. Workshops functioned as information hubs where knowledge of markets, materials, and local events circulated. Apprentices and journeymen became intermediaries, transmitting news and shaping perceptions. Craft production was therefore not only material, but social, linking households, markets, and towns through both tangible goods and human networks. Over time, the cumulative effect of these hidden labors shaped medieval society in subtle but enduring ways. Roads, bridges, buildings, tools, and everyday items were maintained by steady, disciplined work. Economic stability, urban growth, and community cohesion all depended on these overlooked contributions. The medieval world you see in chronicles, castles, battles, and kings would have been impossible without the slow, precise, and relentless labor of craftsmen. And as you consider the quiet endurance of these individuals, a reflection emerges. History often highlights the dramatic and visible, yet it is the persistent, often invisible labor of ordinary people that sustains society itself. Craftsmen may not appear in royal records or epic tales, but their work underpinned the functioning of towns, the reliability of trade, and the survival of communities. So, as this story concludes, a lingering thought remains. In a society so dependent on unseen skill and labor, how many of the events, developments, and successes recorded in history were made possible only because of the steady hands and quiet endurance of those who never received recognition. When you imagine medieval meals, you might picture hearty stews, rustic bread, and the occasional roasted meat. What you rarely consider is how unpredictable, dangerous, and even deadly food could be. For most people, diet was a delicate balance between necessity, scarcity, and chance. While historians often focus on banquets and the diets of the elite, the ordinary diet carried risks that shaped health, behavior, and survival in ways that rarely appear in the chronicles. For peasants and townsfolk, meals were simple but repetitive. Bread, usually coarse, dark, and sometimes mixed with bran or other fillers, formed the staple of nearly every meal. Porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains provided bulk and calories, though its nutritional content varied widely depending on soil quality, harvest success, and available ingredients. Vegetables were seasonal and limited, often boiled or stored for long periods, which affected taste and nutrient value. Meat was infrequent for most households, usually reserved for special occasions, though offal and salted or smoked meats appeared more regularly for those who could afford them. Preservation was a constant challenge. Refrigeration did not exist, Salt, smoking, drying, or pickling were the primary means of keeping food edible. Even then, spoilage was common. Grain could harbor mold, bread could become infested with weevils, and stored vegetables could rot quickly. Consuming spoiled food could lead to illness ranging from mild discomfort to deadly infection. You learned to rely on smell, taste, and appearance, but these were imperfect guides. Some poisons, particularly from certain mushrooms or grains affected by ergot fungus, were invisible yet highly toxic. Drink carried its own hazards. Water sources were often contaminated by human or animal waste, making direct consumption risky. Beer and ale were safer alternatives, because the brewing process reduced microbial contamination. However, alcohol content varied widely, and beverages were sometimes diluted or contaminated in the process. Even wine, typically more common among the elite, could spoil if improperly stored. Consuming these drinks regularly could have both health benefits and hidden dangers, including intoxication, dependency, or chronic illness over time. Food scarcity intensified risks. During lean years, families stretched supplies, substituted ingredients, or relied on wild foods of uncertain safety. Starvation forced consumption of otherwise inedible plants or roots. In extreme cases, famine led to desperate measures, including theft or the consumption of diseased animals. The consequences of these choices could be immediate and severe, but survival demanded such risks. Hygiene shaped dietary safety. Kitchens were often close to living quarters, and sanitation was minimal. Utensils were reused without thorough cleaning, animals might roam freely, and pests infested food stores. Cooking methods varied, but heat alone could not always eliminate pathogens. Infants, the elderly, and the sick were particularly vulnerable. Mortality in these groups was influenced heavily by dietary hazards, alongside broader social and environmental factors. Economic pressures influenced what people ate and how they prepared it. Tradespeople, laborers, and artisans depended on purchasing power to supplement household production. Market access and seasonal fluctuations determined both quantity and quality of food. Spices and preserved goods were rare outside urban centers or among wealthier households, and even then, authenticity could be questionable. Counterfeit or adulterated goods added another layer of risk. Cultural practices also shaped consumption. Religious observances dictated fasting days, often reducing food intake for long periods. Observing these rules could inadvertently weaken health, especially when combined with already marginal diets. Social norms influenced portion sizes, the timing of meals, and acceptable foods, creating a complex interplay between morality, survival, and nutrition. Despite the dangers, people adapted. Recipes, storage techniques, and culinary knowledge evolved to mitigate risks. Knowledge was passed orally, through trial and error, and through local traditions. Survival depended on keen observation, memory, and community wisdom. Sharing knowledge within families or neighborhoods was as critical as the food itself. As you picture these tables, hearths, and storage rooms, the hazards become apparent. Every meal carried uncertainty. Survival demanded constant vigilance, careful preparation, and an understanding of local conditions. Food was not simply nourishment, it was a site of risk, adaptation, and endurance. And as Section 1 closes, a question emerges: if the everyday act of eating could be so perilous, how did medieval communities develop strategies to protect health, sustain families, and maintain productivity, despite the constant threats hidden in what they consumed? As you continue to examine the daily realities of medieval eating, it becomes clear that food and drink were not only sources of nourishment, but also instruments of risk, adaptation, and survival. People had to manage scarcity, contamination, and unpredictable supply while preserving health and productivity, a balancing act that required constant attention and ingenuity. Seasonal variation shaped the bulk of the diet. Grains, vegetables, and fruits were available only during specific times, forcing households to preserve and ration carefully. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions could last into winter if stored in cellars or pits, but even these were vulnerable to rot and pests. Legumes such as beans and peas provided protein, but quantities were limited, and preparation required knowledge to remove toxins or reduce indigestible fibers. Consuming improperly prepared foods could cause illness, which was particularly dangerous for children, the elderly, and the sick. Meat, when available, was often preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Fresh meat was a luxury for most households, and quickly spoiled without ice or refrigeration. Salted meats could sustain a family, but too much salt could cause digestive problems, while improperly cured products could harbor bacteria. Fish, especially in coastal areas or during religious fasting periods, provided an alternative protein source, but preservation challenges remained. Smoking or pickling fish could extend shelf life, yet spoilage and contamination were constant concerns. Grain preparation itself posed hazards. Flour might be contaminated with insects or fungi. Rye, affected by ergot fungus, produced hallucinogenic and toxic compounds, causing ergotism, a debilitating and sometimes deadly condition. Bakers had to inspect grain carefully, sift flour, and ensure loaves were fully baked to reduce risk. Bread, the mainstay of diet, could sustain life, but also spread contamination if improperly stored. Alcoholic beverages, particularly beer and ale, were central to survival, not merely indulgence. Brewing offered a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water, and alcohol provided calories. However, brewing required skill, timing, and attention to cleanliness. Overly weak beer might encourage water consumption, while overly strong beer could lead to intoxication. Wine, mainly for the wealthy or religious communities, required careful storage in barrels to avoid spoilage or contamination by bacteria or mold. Famine years intensified these hazards. Crop failures forced reliance on wild plants, roots, and foraged items, many of which were unfamiliar or toxic. Hunger drove people to consume spoiled or otherwise unsafe foods. Starvation weakened the body, making even minor illnesses from contaminated food potentially fatal. Families developed knowledge of edible wild plants, storage techniques, and improvisation, but these measures were far from foolproof. Market conditions added another layer of risk. Merchants might sell adulterated products, watered-down ale, mixed flour, or spoiled meat. Trust in sellers was vital, and local knowledge determined who could provide reliable goods. Social networks and reputation played critical roles in mitigating risk. Households with broader connections were more likely to secure safe supplies, while isolated families faced higher exposure to hazards. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, compounded danger. Kitchens were small, often connected to living spaces, and shared by multiple generations. Animals roamed freely. Utensils and cooking vessels were rarely sterilized. Cross-contamination was common, and pests infested both food stores and preparation areas. Techniques to reduce contamination, such as boiling, roasting, or pickling, were well known but not universally applied, and mistakes could have immediate consequences. Despite these hazards, medieval households developed routines to manage risk. Daily practices included careful inspection of ingredients, rotation of stored goods, and shared knowledge of which foods were safe at particular times of year. Fasting schedules, religious dietary rules, and communal customs all interacted with these survival strategies, requiring negotiation between spiritual, social, and physical needs. The psychological impact of this reality was subtle but persistent. Mealtime involved awareness and calculation as much as nourishment. Decisions about what to eat, how to prepare it, and how to allocate scarce resources weighed heavily on families. Anxiety about spoilage, illness, or hunger was ever present, shaping behavior and planning. As you step back from these kitchens, markets, and hearths, the risks of medieval sustenance become clear. Survival depended not only on availability, but on knowledge, vigilance, and adaptability. Food was simultaneously life-sustaining and dangerous, and households navigated this tension daily. And as Section 2 concludes, a question lingers. If ordinary meals carried such hidden hazards, how did communities, households, and individuals manage to survive year after year, season after season, without succumbing to illness or starvation? As you reach the final section of this story, the cumulative impact of medieval dietary hazards becomes strikingly clear. Survival depended on more than sheer labor or resourcefulness. It required vigilance, adaptation, and collective knowledge. Food and drink, so central to life, were never neutral. They carried both sustenance and risk, shaping the health, behavior, and endurance of entire communities. One of the most persistent threats was contamination. Even when households exercised caution, spoiled grain, moldy vegetables, or improperly preserved meat could cause illness. Outbreaks of gastrointestinal disease, ergotism, and other foodborne ailments were frequent, especially in years of scarcity. The consequences ranged from temporary debilitation to death, with children, the elderly, and the sick particularly vulnerable. Households developed methods of inspection and preparation to reduce risk, but these were not foolproof. Survival often depended on keen senses, intuition, and accumulated knowledge passed through families and neighbors. Alcoholic beverages remained a staple for both nutrition and safety. Beer, ale, and wine offered calories, hydration, and some protection against pathogens found in water. Brewing and storage required careful attention. Spoiled batches could be harmful, while insufficient alcohol left households exposed to contaminated water. Consumption practices were thus a form of risk management, blending necessity, habit, and social custom. Famine years exposed the fragility of these systems. Crop failures, livestock disease, or political disruptions could quickly escalate food scarcity into crises. Families were forced to improvise with wild plants, roots, or even food that would normally be avoided. Reliance on these measures brought new risks, including poisoning, nutritional deficiencies, and social conflict over limited resources. Communities often responded collectively, pooling resources, redistributing food, or coordinating aid through religious and civic networks. These strategies mitigated risk, but could not eliminate it entirely. The cumulative effect of these hazards shaped behavior, social norms, and even cultural practices. Cooking methods, preservation techniques, and meal routines were embedded with knowledge of risk. Religious observances, such as fasting, were negotiated against physical necessity. Market interactions required judgment about the reliability of sellers, the quality of goods, and seasonal availability. Nutrition, hygiene, and social trust were intertwined in ways that influenced survival as much as physical labor did. Psychologically, the constant negotiation between nourishment and danger created vigilance and caution. Families learned to read subtle signs: the smell of grain, the texture of bread, the appearance of vegetables. They observed animal behavior as indicators of spoilage or contamination. Knowledge was cumulative, shared orally across generations, and critical for enduring the uncertainty of daily meals. Yet, despite these persistent hazards, medieval communities adapted and endured. They developed informal networks of information and support, shared food, and taught survival skills to children early. Adaptation was slow, incremental, and often learned through trial and error, but it allowed people to live, work, and reproduce even under precarious conditions. Meals were never simply about pleasure or taste. They were exercises in survival, resilience, and applied knowledge. Reflecting on this, it becomes clear that the medieval diet shaped more than physical health. It influenced social interaction, economic exchange, labor patterns, and even cultural and religious practice. Ordinary meals were sites where the risks of everyday life were negotiated quietly, yet with profound impact on survival and societal continuity. And so, as this story closes, a lingering thought emerges. If something as basic as eating could carry hidden dangers capable of shaping generations, how much of history's continuity depended on the careful management, vigilance, and resilience of ordinary people, quietly enduring risks that few chroniclers ever recorded?